The 14th Amendment states that there is to be equal protection under law for all people. No state can make a law that would deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. Liberty is the state or condition of people who are able to act and speak freely. The right to work is acting freely. The Constitution states that no citizen can be deprived of liberty. Doesn't that mean that everyone is allowed to get a job if they choose to do so? The 14th Amendment fueled the fight for civil rights and the demand for equal rights for all Americans. Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, putting ability into responsibility. In 1980, the disabled population of the United States of America began to join forces to start the fight for equal rights for all disabled people. People with disabilities realized that they were not treated the same as non-disabled people, and they wanted that to change. They knew that it was the government's responsibility to make a change, so they got the government's attention by petitioning and protesting and using their First Amendment rights. The major lack of equality was in the ability to find a job. Having a job is important in today's society, but disabled people could not find employers that would hire them. They wanted to participate in the workforce, but felt as if they could not. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 was created to open new doors for the disabled. It stated that the disabled cannot be discriminated against and accommodations must be made for them. Economically, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 actually created problems. Some businesses were forced to cut pay because of some of the more costly accommodations needed for disabled employees. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 was written to create equal opportunities for disabled people in society. Although there were many complications with the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, it was a start to equality for disabled people in the United States. 4 disabled people were recognized as people able to do tasks. Many of them were forced into institutions and left there to live out their life. In 1887, a newspaper reporter who exposed the living conditions, Nellie Bly, said this about these institutions: "They are a human rat trap. It is easy to get in, but once there, it is impossible to get out." Many veterans of World War I returned home disabled. Some legislation was passed to help the veterans, but nothing drastic changed the situation. In 1935, the Social Security Act was passed and gave funding for assistance to blind individuals and disabled children. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was passed and made sure that all children, even disabled ones, had the chance to get an education. Many protests took place by disabled people to make sure they had everyone's attention. In the 1970s, the American Disabled for Accessible Public Transit took action to protect what little rights disabled people had then. During the 1980s, the disabled movement formed an alliance with traditional civil rights and feminist groups. Pat Wright, the director of the Disabilities Rights Education and Defense Fund, said, "Standing alone, we could not have done a protest on that scale. But wrapped in the arms of the civil rights community, we had a lot more power." By the end of the 1980s, the disabled population's frustration could no longer be contained. They demanded to have the same rights as everyone else. Protests increased and supporters multiplied in number. On July 26, 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law by President Herbert Walker Bush. The Americans with Disabilities Act was created to prohibit discrimination in employment, transportation, and commercial facilities. It also requires businesses to make accommodations for their disabled employees. These accommodations would include things such as modifying the building, hiring an interpreter, changing work schedules, or letting them have more leaves of absence.
This is an immensely important day, a day that belongs to all of you. And everywhere I look, I see people who have dedicated themselves to making sure that this day would come to pass.
On September 25, 2008, President George Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act Amendment Act. The newly amended version restored the civil rights of the disabled population and overturned 4 Supreme Court cases that had unfairly narrowed the protection of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Government became more involved in helping disabled people and protecting their rights after the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. Robert Williams, a man with cerebral palsy, was appointed by President Clinton in 1993 as Commissioner for the Administration on Developmental Disabilities. This made him the first person with a developmental disability to fill this role. Little by little, more disabled people began filling roles of importance. President Obama and the U.S. Department of Labor issued a proposed rule in 2011 that strongly encouraged contractors to set a goal of having at least 7% of their workforce from the disabled population. After the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, documentaries focusing on disabilities were made. For example, When Billy Broke His Head and Many Other Tales of Wonder first aired May 1, 1995. It was one of the first documentaries about disabilities. Many new support groups were also created to keep the disability movement alive. The Autism National Committee in 1990, the Committee of 10,000 in 1990, and the American Association of People with Disabilities in 1995 were all put into place to increase the rights of the disabled. Pat Wright, who developed blindness while in college, said, "You can't legislate attitudes, but the attitudinal barriers will drop the more disabled people are hired, the more they can be seen on the street, and when we become not just a silent minority, but full participating members of society."
I know that people with disabilities want to go to work. They want to feel the pride of earning a paycheck, and they have talents that they can contribute.
Structural changes needed in the workplace for disabled employees were a part of the Americans with Disabilities Act. However, these accommodations would prove to be costly. According to the President's Job Accommodation Network, 12% of these needed accommodations cost more than $2,000, and 4% ended up costing more than $5,000. A small firm would be overwhelmed by these costs. This made some companies hesitant to hire disabled people. By 1998, there were 108,939 charges against businesses were filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Most of these charges were because of discharges, layoffs and suspensions, or failure to make an accommodation. The threat of having a charge filed against them or having to make a costly accommodation made many businesses rethink hiring a disabled person. In 1965, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was created to put an end to discrimination in the workplace. They helped create laws to make it illegal to discriminate against people because of their race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, and finally, disability or genetic information. Disabilities were added to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in 1992 after the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission hoped to stop discrimination so that more disabled people would be hired. However, the threat of having a charge against themselves, some companies shied away from hiring disabled people, causing less opportunities for the disabled population. The Survey of Income and Program Participation says that after the Americans with Disabilities Act, employment of disabled men went down by 10.9%, while employment of non-disabled men went down by only 3.1%.
Because of the ADA, I have a foundation that provides people with disabilities, like me, the support for our rights as human beings and Americans.
The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 was created to tear down all the barriers against the disabled people in the United States of America. Disabled people fought very hard to get the same rights as everyone else. They exercised all of their First Amendment rights, such as protesting, freedom of speech, and petitioning. The disabled population felt the Declaration of Independence applied to them when it said that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words to the disabled population meant that it was the government's responsibility to ensure the right to pursue happiness. Happiness for the disabled people is employment. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 was the beginning of a new age for the disabled population. Everything has to start somewhere.